you talked about this book Wilberforce wrote about, let's say, true Christianity. And I've been trying to think through what it might mean practically and graspably, I suppose, that each person is in some sense of axiomatic worth.
Yeah.
That's the axis around which all belief must turn, all productive belief. And so I think it has something to do with the nature of consciousness itself. All of us are very particularized creatures, right? So we're only going to make ourselves manifest in the world once. We're a very unlikely combination of genetic improbability. And so biologically, we're each unique. And then the circumstances we're thrown into are also unique. And so we're each the conjunction of two unique situations, let's say, highly unique. But each of us, within those unique circumstances, with those unique talents, have to grapple with, let's say, we have to grapple with the possibility that's laid out in front of us. And we each have to do that in a particularized way. And if I, as a conscious being, if I grapple with the possibility that lays itself out in front of me, I can bring something into being that only I can bring into being because I'm particularized. And then the thing that's so remarkable about that is that because I can communicate, and that's part of this fact that I'm imbued with this logos, which is really the capacity to communicate, if I create something unique, if I realize something unique because of that particularity, I can then share it with other people.
Yeah.
And so that means they can, weirdly, even though we're all particularized, we can all benefit from the operation of our own particularity.
Yeah.
And there's this idea that's deeply embedded in the Christian belief system that whatever Christ is the word that generates order out of chaos, made flesh, right? And then he's God himself, which is the process that generates habitable order out of chaos, made human. And it's a very interesting idea because what it means is that there's a universal principle, that's the logos itself, the word, that finds its embodiment in the particularities of time and place, right? So that unites, let's say, a little town in the Middle East 2,000 years ago with the divine itself. And that's a model for a human being, is that we each embody this process of encountering chaos and potential and transforming it into habitable order. That's what's laid out in Genesis 1. And we each do that in a way that's communicable and that's universally valuable because we can share it. And insofar as our societies are set up to insist that that be allowed to happen, then our societies can be productive, reciprocal, and generous. And then we can operate collectively to compete and cooperate in a manner that elevates all of us.
Yeah.
And I don't think any of that's arbitrary. So when we're talking about, it seems necessary that every culture has to establish itself in relationship to something like axiomatic presuppositions. You have to make some presuppositions. Maybe the left makes the presupposition that the motive force of the world is power. It's something like that. Certainly the postmodernists do that. But you could say that, well, Western culture, insofar as it's been guided by the highest possible spirit, has made the axiomatic presumption that every person is of a divine value. And that means they have something that's intrinsically valuable to offer, to bring into reality itself. That's why you're not supposed to hide your light under a bushel, let's say. And then I think you can make a very practical case that, well, isn't it valuable to learn from the particularized experience of someone else? I mean, what an unbelievable advantage that is that I can sit here and talk to you.
Yeah.
And everything that you had to learn painfully, you can communicate to me.
Yeah.
And if I have any sense at all, I can listen, and then I can learn that without having to undergo all that suffering. And then you might think, well, isn't it the case that if we set up societies on that basis, so that everybody is regarded as a valid source of redemptive information, we can all exchange that, and isn't that the proper pathway to life more abundant and peace and generous reciprocity? That all seems to me to be just true. And that's instantiated in voluntary free market economies fundamentally because we get to freely exchange the goods that we can freely produce.
So we can both profit.
So that, and more than that even, I would say, so that we can both profit in a way that helps us walk uphill more and more efficiently, and that we can both do that in a way that's simultaneously good for everyone around us. We can actually do that. And I don't think any of that's arbitrary. And so one of the things that's worth pointing out is that if your stated goal is something like the removal of oppression, we can say, well, congratulations to you, you're not on the sides of the tyrants. But if the consequence of your critique of Western civilization is that you throw the baby, the divine baby, we might say, out with the bathwater, and you don't recognize that this insistence on the intrinsic worth of each individual is actually a precondition for your objection to slavery, you're going to destroy the very thing that you think that you're promoting.
I think we're doing that right now.
I think we're doing that as well.
That is what I think we're doing.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I mean, you've put it beautifully, and I agree with what I've understood you've said, but I'd just add to it. How stupid are we if we not only fail to learn from one another, but we won't bring back the great figures of history and the learning of time to the table for their wisdom as well? Why not tap into that?
Well, that's
and
what
we'll avoid a heap more
mistakes.
mistakes.
Educated.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, we're certainly doing that with regard to Wilberforce.
That's my point.
Well, it's kind of a miracle in some sense, and I truly don't understand this. You know, I was in the UK earlier this year, and I went to one of the chapels there that had I think it was in Oxford, but might have been in Cambridge, that had a statue of Wilberforce. You know, and that was a rather emotional moment for me because I know that he was a stunningly remarkable person, and it was out of his efforts that Britain organized itself for 175 years to suppress slavery. And so
with his teammates. Never forget his teammates.
Right.
Just like budget repair in Australia. It's a team. Right. But he led it.
And also with his alliance with great figures of the past. I mean, his morality was informed by his Christian faith, and that emerged out of this great Judeo-Christian tradition. I mean, he didn't do that. He did that by allowing that spirit to inhabit him. He didn't do that on his own, right? So, but what I really can't understand, it's very difficult for me to understand why that story isn't more well known and more celebrated, especially among people who purport to be advancing the doctrine that we need to fight against oppression. It's like, well, here's a man who did it. Here's why he did it. And the historical evidence on that is quite clear. And like you said, it's a perverse story because he was extremely entitled and an attractive person and could have whiled away his time.
He died penniless. He gave it all away.
So why don't we teach that story? Like, what the hell's going on exactly? Why would that be suppressed in some real sense? It's really quite stunning.
It is stunning, and it troubles me deeply. And perhaps, Jordan, it's because it raises the question of this. Was the Christ that he believed in real? And, oh no, we don't want to confront that possibility. But I say, personally, I think every one of us should.
Well, it seemed to work for Wilberforce. And so, you know, I've been thinking about this in detail too. And so, of course, these questions always hinge on what you mean by real. But I would say that pain is pretty real. Everybody acts as if that's true. That's for sure, right?
We feel it.
Everyone acts like pain is real. And so then you might say, well, if pain is real, what allows you to cope with pain or transcend pain must be more real. Because if something's real and you encounter something that is more significant than that, you have to attribute reality to that. So I just walked Via Dolorosa, the Stations of the Cross with Jonathan Pageau in Jerusalem. And whether or not the events that took place at each of these stations actually took place there is in some sense beside the point. You can think about it as a dramatic forum, Jerusalem itself, and if you're a pilgrim, you can go walk through this catastrophic story of tragic suffering. And because I'm a psychologist, I'm always thinking, well, what exactly, strip away the religious issue for the moment, what exactly are people doing when they apprehend the figure of the crucifixion and when they do something like consider Christ's passion or walk the stations of the cross? What are they doing psychologically? And I actually think it's quite clear. I think that what people are doing is voluntarily exposing themselves to a portrait of tragic suffering. And And more than that, there's more to it than that, but that's a good place to start. It's like, let's say we all have to deal with the catastrophe of life, with the pain and limitation of life. And so then you might say, well, how do you do that? How is it even possible to do that? And one answer might be, hide from it, bury your head in the sand. And I'm not being smart about this. It's like, the less you think about your mortal vulnerability, the better off you'll be. It's an insoluble problem. Your best bet is to run away from that realization, to keep yourself blind, and maybe to busy yourself with as much hedonic pleasure as you can possibly manage.
Drown your sorrows.
Well, and that's understandable, right? You could say, okay, well, a case can be made for that. But it's not a very psychologically astute case, because one of the things that psychologists have figured out in the last 100 years is that if you want to stabilize people psychologically, and if you want to imbue them with courage, then what you do is you help them expose themselves voluntarily to the things they're afraid of that they're avoiding. It's a very powerful technique. That's exposure therapy. And what exposure therapy seems to do is to make people braver. And I'll tell you how exposure therapy works, because it's no joke. So I had a client who was afraid that he would cut himself. And he was afraid that if he was on the top of a building, that he would jump off to his death. And one of the exercises we worked out was that he would sit at the top of his building near the edge with a knife. Right? And that's a very frightening thing to do as a therapist, because he's saying, look, I have this impulse to slash my throat and to jump off a building. And I thought, well, why don't you confront both of those things at the same time? Now, we worked up to that, but I'm just using that as an example to show you how intense that exposure therapy can be. It's like we need to identify okay. So then you might think, well, what are people most fundamentally afraid of? And I would say, well, it's something like pain and death. And then even more particularly, it's unjust pain and death. And that's really at the core of the crucifixion image and story, because it's unjust suffering and death. And so the psychological, what would you say? Why have people been compelled to gaze upon this image of unjust suffering? And the answer is something like, the best way to adapt to life is to gaze on the image of unjust suffering, to do that fully. And I think that's true.
It's been a big,
And there's this strange idea too, and this is a very strange idea, that the spirit that guides the Israelites out of the desert, say in the Exodus story, so the spirit that stands against tyranny and that stands against slavery, is the same spirit that confronts tragic mortality voluntarily, right? There's an equation. That's the equation of the New Testament and the Old Testament. And I also think that's likely true, that the pattern that calls to us from within to object to tyranny and slavery is the same pattern that enables us to have the courage to look upon our own mortality, like forthrightly. And I would say that has to be that way to some degree, because imagine you want to stand up to a tyrant. Well, you could put your life at risk to do that, right? I mean, if you're going to speak truth to power, to use that terrible cliche, you're going to have to face the fact that you might be hurt and even killed in doing so. And so how can it be different to face the inevitability of your own mortality for a moral cause and stand up to a tyrant? Those have to be the same thing. And so I would say it's time for all of us to learn that these axiomatic presuppositions, like the idea that part of what gives us intrinsic value is the fact that we're reflections of the Word made flesh, that actually turns out to be true. It's not just it's true in the deepest possible sense. And if we abandon that, which is what we're doing, we're not going to eradicate tyranny, we're going to fall prey to it.